You've heard of Lady Godiva, even if it's just because of chocolate, but you may not know all the details of Lady Godiva's story. Did she really ride naked through the streets to protest high taxes, or is that just a myth? Here's the legend of Lady Godiva finally explained. The answer to your first question is yes, Lady Godiva was a real person. She lived in 11th century England and was married to a powerful earl by the name of Leofric, who ruled Mercia and Coventry. But if you believe the historical records, the real Godiva didn't really do much, as those records barely mention her. She appears to have had at least one son, Alfgar, who became Earl of East Anglia. She also had a granddaughter who married King Harold II and became Queen of England. At least temporarily, since Harold died rather spectacularly at the Battle of Hastings just 1 year after their wedding. So Godiva's official historical record is mostly just about her offspring, which is kind of how things went when you were a woman in the Middle Ages. No matter what you did, people really only remembered the deeds of your husband, your sons, or the men your daughters married. So while Godiva might not have been noted much by contemporary historians, that doesn't necessarily mean she wasn't noteworthy. It just means that no one wrote down most of the things she did. Godiva is a name that has sort of evolved over the centuries, probably because it sounds nicer than her real name, which was Godgifu, which means good gift, but it's kind of a mouthful. Imagine eating a piece of Godgifu chocolate. Godgifu wasn't only not Godiva, she also wasn't a lady. According to how stuff works, in 11th century Anglo-Saxon England, an earl's wife would have been referred to as the earl's wife, or even worse, as the earl's bed partner. In Godiva's time, lady was reserved for the queen and the queen alone, so Godiva's granddaughter would have briefly been lady, but Godiva herself would not have used that title. So her true and accurate name and title would have been Leofric Earls Jebeta Godgifu. Now put that on a piece of chocolate. Though we don't know much about the real Godiva, there are a few tantalizing pieces of information in the historical record. According to the BBC, Godiva and Leofric founded a Benedictine monastery, and she must have been a pretty pious person because it's said that she had all of her gold and silver melted down and remade into images of saints, crosses, and other objects, which she donated to the monastery. Godiva outlived her husband by a decade and was supposedly buried in the Abbey Church alongside him, though no one knows for sure if that's true. You can check out her potential final resting place for yourself, though, if you're interested. The remains of the monastery and cathedral can now be seen in Priory Row, Coventry. None of that is why you're here, though. You don't care about someone's dusty old bones that may or may not be under some monastery or another. You want to hear about the legend, the streaking, riding around with no clothes on. It's okay, everyone else does too. Just in case you're not familiar with all the details of the story, it goes like this. Lady Godiva was troubled by the crushingly oppressive taxes her husband had levied on the people under his rule. She implored him repeatedly to lighten the people's burden, but he was a hard man and would not budge. Still, his wife pestered him until finally, in exasperation, he told her he'd lift the taxes when she rode in the buff through the town marketplace. So she did, though she had her long hair to cover up all the important bits.
Don't you understand? Her ladyship is doing this for you! To lift the burden of taxes from your back!
Out of respect, the citizens were asked not to look outside as she rode by. One guy did, of course, because there's always one guy who totally would, but he was struck blind for his indiscretion. In the story, the peeker is called Tom, which is where we get the expression Peeping Tom from.
Let all decent folk remember you peeked, and may they despise your very name! Peeping Tom!
Upon Godiva's return, Leofric lifted the taxes, and the citizens of Coventry, except for that one guy Tom, were forever grateful. The end. Except that's not the end, because none of that really happened. The story of Godiva's disrobed ride through the streets didn't even appear until a couple of centuries after her death. According to the Britain Express, the story first appears in the chronicles of Roger of Wendover, who was a monk at the Abbey of St. Albans. Roger wasn't exactly known for his stellar attention to historical accuracy, and the apparent source material was a little questionable too. The abbey was at a major crossroads, so it's very possible he just picked it up as a tall tale from a passing traveler. That seems more likely when you consider that the story describes a town with streets and a marketplace, and 11th century Coventry had neither. It was a rural farming community with a population of maybe 350 serfs. Bottom line, somebody probably made it all up. So the question is, why? If you know anything about the pagan origins of Christmas and other beloved Christian holidays, you won't be surprised to hear that the Godiva story might have just been an adaptation of a very old tradition that existed in parts of Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia. According to British history, a naked woman riding a horse through a town or village may have been a representation of a fertility goddess in an ancient fertility rite that over the years morphed into a symbolic procession. Pagan rituals like this were obviously at odds with Christian teachings, but sometimes, like with Easter eggs and the Easter Bunny, they were so ingrained in the local culture that missionaries trying to convert people to Christianity would just keep those ideas and adapt them into something more Christian. So it's possible that the story was simply co-opted by the monks who later wrote it down. And instead of a pagan fertility goddess riding through the town in order to promote the well-being of crops and animals, it was turned into a pious lady who was making a great sacrifice for the well-being of her people. Even that message got a major tweak in the 17th century, though, with the addition of Peeping Tom to the tale. With the instruction of Tom, the legend suddenly went from being a story of a noblewoman who made a selfless sacrifice for the benefit of the townspeople to a story about the evils of lust and the blessings of chastity, which is a very different lesson. In Lady Godiva, A Literary History of the Legend, Professor Daniel Donahue wrote, "Over time, Tom would become the scapegoat and bear the symbolic guilt for the people's desire to look at this naked woman. The peak of this interpretation came in Lord Alfred Tennyson's 19th century poem Godiva, where Tom's eyes, quote, shriveled into darkness in his head and dropped before him, which implies some sort of divine punishment, though in modern adaptations, sometimes that punishment is much more human."
Tom!
Need more proof that the story was purely allegorical and not real? Well, another way we know this is the fact that taxes just didn't work like that at the time. According to how stuff works, Godiva owned Coventry before she married Leofric, which means that she would have had the power to reduce taxes there without having to seek his permission anyway. The idea that the noble lady had to implore her husband to lower taxes in her own land smacks of much later property laws. Then there's the fact that during the 11th century, Coventry was just a small piece of farmland, probably too small to even warrant taxation. Evidence from the 13th century suggests that there were no taxes paid in Coventry at the time, with the exception of, ironically, a tax on horses. And while some people think that's evidence that Leofric lifted taxes after his wife's bear ride, it's more likely just a reflection of the fact that there really was nothing in Coventry worth taxing, so a ride with no clothes would have been pretty pointless. Of course, some people still believe that part of the legend of Lady Godiva must have been true. After all, where there's smoke, there's a fire. In this case, the smoke is pretty thin, but it's there. It turns out that Abbey Godiva founded had ties to the abbey where the historian Roger of Wendover lived. Remember, that's the guy who first recorded the story, so some people think he might have gotten the tale from their records. Something made more plausible by the fact that much of his work is derived from previous church histories and records that he reinterpreted. Some historians also wonder if the story does not refer to a literal state of undress. Perhaps the manuscript that Roger was theoretically working from only mentioned stripping, which could refer to Godiva taking off her jewelry and other finery. A noblewoman riding through the town dressed as a peasant would have made a strong statement on its own. So if you like this story and you want it to be true, well, there are a few tendrils to cling to. Weirdly, the one thing in the story that seems to be completely accurate is the idea that Godiva had super long golden hair to cover herself with. That seems likely something someone made up, but nope, there's actually archaeological evidence suggesting it's true. According to the Telegraph, monasteries in the Middle Ages often put stained glass portraits of their benefactors on the west side of the building. Godiva's monastery at Coventry was destroyed during the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1500s, and so was a stained glass portrait on the west side of the building, presumed to be a portrait of the monastery's benefactor. When archaeologists pieced it back together, though, it showed the image of a woman with very long golden hair. Archaeologists don't believe the portrait shows the image of a saint, since there is no halo or headdress. And its position on the west side of the monastery appears to imply that it is indeed the portrait of the monastery's benefactor. Since the image is clearly a woman, it's not a huge leap to conclude that it's a portrait of the real Lady Godiva. So what does it mean that the hair in the portrait appears to precisely match the legendary hair of Godiva on horseback? Probably nothing, but it's still a pretty intriguing detail. Fact or fiction, the town of Coventry loves Lady Godiva, and they've been holding an annual Godiva procession off and on since 1678. By the end of the 18th century, the procession had become a raucous affair, including a woman wearing a tight-fitting flesh-colored outfit. The event was popular with the townspeople, but not so much with the church. And after the disastrous procession of 1842, where Godiva got so drunk she couldn't stay on her horse under her own power, the church started speaking out against the tradition. By 1900, it had ceased to be an annual tradition, only being held occasionally, and that's pretty much how it was until 1998, when the much less prudish and thoroughly modern town of Coventry decided not only to resurrect the tradition, but to also turn it into a major entertainment festival. Today's Godiva Festival includes 3 days of music and fun and attracts close to 150,000 people every year. and it's paid for with local taxes. We think Lady Godiva would have been proud. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.